I think we've got a better time.
Okay, great. Let's do it. Well, good afternoon for those of you who are on the East Coast, and good morning if you're on the West Coast. Thanks for being here for today's webinar, Recruiting and Building a Strong and Effective Board. My name is Stephen Shattuck, and I'm the VP of Marketing here at Bloomerang, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. And today I'm joined by two experts in fundraising. The first is Keith Curtis. Hey there, Keith.
How are you? Thanks for having me.
Good. Yeah, great to have you. Very exciting for you to be here. And for those of you who don't know Keith, he's a 30-year veteran who has worked with some of the largest YMCAs in the country. He's worked with a multi-billion-dollar healthcare system, as well as arts, cultural, and educational organizations. And even makes time for some of the smaller nonprofits, such as free clinics, animal shelters, and hospices. He's currently president of the Curtis Group, where his team has developed strategies to raise hundreds of millions of dollars for more than 150 clients. And he's also a sought-after advisor and speaker, making up to 40 presentations a year, not including this one, which we're very happy to have him here. He's going to share some of his knowledge on recruiting and building effective boards. So great to have you here, Keith.
Glad to be here. Thank you, Stephen.
And also joining us, as always, is my colleague Jay Love. He's the co-founder and CEO over here at Bloomerang. Hey there, Jay.
Hey, hello there. And for all of you out there, if you've not had a chance to hear or see Keith speak before, you're really in for a treat this afternoon. I'm looking forward to just joining in here and there, but watching it all unfold. So looking forward to it.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm also excited. This is a topic that a lot of folks have been requesting for our webinars, and it's one that Jay and I have wanted to cover for a while now. So very excited to be talking about boards here with Keith. So what's going to happen today is Keith is going to get us started. He's got a really great presentation. I had a chance to peek at some of his slides a little earlier today. And once he's done, he's going to hand it over to Jay, who's going to talk about board membership from sort of the other side of the equation that Keith is going to talk about. And then after they're both done, what we'll do, as we always do, is jump right into a Q&A session. And we'd like that to be interactive. So if you hear anything during the presentation that maybe you want explained or elaborated on further, please do not hesitate to send questions and comments over the chat window right there on your webinar screen. And I'll see those. Keith and Jay will also see those, and we'll try to answer just as many questions as possible before the 2 o'clock hour. So with that, I'm not going to take up any more time. I'm going to hand it off to Keith, who's going to get us started. So Keith, take it away.
Thank you, Stephen. And I want to thank everybody who's with us, either good morning or good afternoon, and Jay and all the folks at Bloomerang for inviting us and having us today. And also want to thank one of my colleagues, Aaron Phillips, who's a consultant and our marketing director with our firm, who's been a big help in pulling all of this together. So, if you have questions afterwards, either, visit our site, and either Aaron and I can talk with you about those. But as Stephen mentioned, our firm, we work with nonprofits, and we're a consultant. And a couple of these slides I'm going to run through real quick for you, because since he's already introduced. But, our role is really helping to promote philanthropy, just like you have. We've done it for a lot of groups. Stephen mentioned that I've been doing this for over 30 years, and our firm has now been around. Next year, we celebrate our 25th anniversary. And we're also involved with a group, and Jay's been part of that over the years, an organization called Giving Institute. We have a sister organization called Giving USA Foundation, which every year talks about who gives in this country, how much they're giving, who they're giving to, why they're giving. I serve as the vice chair of that foundation, and we're going to talk about that a little bit today, because it's all about giving. And as Stephen mentioned, what we find, almost every presentation we do, whether it's a Making the Ask, a Cultivating Donors, anything out there, people are always talking about their boards and how to engage them in fundraising. So we thought it would be important for you just to understand a little bit about what's happening in the philanthropic world as we talk today. Also, as Stephen mentioned, we do a lot of presentations during the year. We do a lot of different services for clients. These are just some of the national conference and forums that we've presented at. And in some cases, again, all of these folks are asking us about what's going on with boards. So what are we going to cover today? We're going to talk a little bit about the importance of individual giving and really the role that your board members and volunteers play in this. We're going to talk about how to create an effective board and really engage your board. One of the things that I'm really excited about is sometimes when we're doing presentations like this, we just have maybe executive directors and development directors. And in this case, we've got, not just those two groups, but we also do have volunteers and board members listening in. So I'm really looking forward to, at the end of the presentation, if you all have some questions as board members or volunteers, make sure that you get those out for us. One of the things when we're doing these presentations, and if we were all together in a room, I would be asking you all about your board. And one of the things that we find from folks, whether we're doing presentations or if we're doing a campaign planning or feasibility study, is that we hear from people some of these questions here. This is their board. Their board will do anything but ask for dollars. Or their board thinks it's the staff's role to raise dollars. And then oftentimes what we find is we're talking to people is what's happened is that many of these board members haven't really been recruited with clear expectations. And so sometimes we can't necessarily expect that a board member is going to do that fundraising if we haven't told them in advance that's what they want to do. We had a client once that a gentleman said when we were interviewing him for a planning study, he said, when they came and asked me to serve on the board, I told them that I didn't want to help them raise money. I'd already done that. And they said, well, that's okay. We just need your name. And he said, and also I feel like I've given you enough money, so I'm not going to give you any more money. And they said, that's okay. We just need your name because you've been a great supporter. And what ultimately ended up happening is about 6 months later, they decided to go into a capital campaign, and they went to this person and asked him to chair the campaign. And when he said no, they got upset at him. And the fact was that they didn't recruit him with really what those clear expectations were. He had told them what he would and would not do, and they decided that they were still going to go ahead and take him on, and were convinced that they would change his mind. So you have to make sure you have those clear expectations, and we're going to talk about that. Your board really has two roles. It's the governance piece, which is frankly the easier piece for most boards, where they're a steward of finances, they're policy makers. But what we're really talking about today is the support piece. Because it's hard to be a steward of finances if you don't have dollars coming in. And so you have to make sure that your board understands that support role where they're helping to donate, where they're helping to raise dollars, where they're a participant in the life of the organization. So that's what we'll be talking about today. But as we go through today, what I want you to think about, again, if we were in a room, we would get that feedback from you of, how are you engaging your board, and how do you recruit new board members? And do you actually meet with board members annually, individually, to talk to them about what their role is? And these are things you need to be doing. So think about those, how you do it now, and how you can improve upon those things as you go through this afternoon or this morning, depending on where you're located. This is a chart from Giving USA that I want to make sure that we touch on. We're not going to spend a lot of time on this, but a couple of things that I want to remind people. This is giving from last year. Americans continue to be incredibly philanthropic. So people are giving away a lot of money. Over $316 billion last year, the third straight year of increases. But the other key thing that I really want you to look at here is that individual giving. And if you look at that, you see that 72% of the money in this country comes directly from individuals, but the other piece is foundations and bequests. Half of the foundation money in this country comes from private family foundations, which are individuals or couples who have set up a structure for their giving, or from bequest, which is an individual who's made a gift at their death. So if you look at this, about 9 out of every $10 in this country comes from individuals. And the reason that that is important for you to know is that your board needs to realize that they get to be connectors because of that. What's also important to realize is that of that individual giving, about half of that comes from high net worth individuals. Those people that you really get to because your board members or volunteers know them. And the thing is once those people give, they have a tendency to give every year as long as you're continuing to build relationships with them. This is important to know because it brings us to this piece that it's all about leadership. We used to always say people give to people. And what we realize is over time is that people don't just give to anybody. If you didn't know me and I called you up, you wouldn't see me. But actually what happens is people, they give to great causes. They invest in great causes. But they give appointments to the right people. So part of what we try to do is get your board members and your volunteers to realize it's really not about the asking. It's really about telling the story and opening doors. Because they're not going to, these donors, if they don't know you, aren't going to open their door to a executive director they don't know, but they will open a door to somebody they do know. And you have to think about that in your own giving. It's so relationship-based. As we go out and we interview people, people tell us over and over again that what they're doing is they're looking for causes to invest in, but because there are over 1 million nonprofits out there, the only way that they can find some of those investments and really validate them is that somebody they know is talking to them about it. So as we look at this, what we realize is that board leadership and volunteer leadership, that is it. And as I mentioned at the beginning, as Jay mentioned, we hear over and over from people, how do we engage our board more? How do we get them to participate? So what we want to do is, again, keep in mind that some of your board members may never ask for gifts, but they can participate. So when we do a lot of our presentations, in every one of them we ask people, how many of you all like to ask for a gift? And probably if I could just see a show of hands today, maybe I'd have a few hands go up. Because people don't like to ask for gifts. But if we ask people, are you comfortable telling the story about the organization? And are you willing to tell that story? What we find is a lot more hands go up. So if you can start to talk to your board about, it's not just about the ask, it's about knowing the story. But in order to make sure you're doing that right, you've got to have an effective board. So here are some of the traits, as we've looked over the years of effective board members. The first is that they really understand your story and your message, and don't assume that they do. I was doing a session not long ago with a board, and we do, during these sessions, we let board members tell their story about why they're involved and why they're excited about an organization. And it was really interesting. This one board member just starts talking about this particular program, and he's so excited about it, and the executive directors at the other end of the room just looking quizzically about, what is this person talking about? It was a program the organization had not done for 2 years. So you've got to make sure not only can people tell the story, but they're telling the right story. You've got to also make sure that you're educating them on development. Even if they're not making the ask, they understand the process of doing that. That they're not just looking at the staff and saying, hey, here are 3 or 4 names, you should go call on them, but they're identifying these people, cultivating them, and helping to recruit these folks, either as donors or maybe even as new board members. And that they understand that they've got to be involved in this planning process and that it's just not the staff's role to do it. This is a chart that AFP had put together not long ago, talking about really the board's different roles when you talk about being really that supporter of your organization. You've got askers, ambassadors, advocates. The advocates are good. They're getting the story out there. They're telling people why the organization is important. But you've really got to have more ambassadors. You've got to have people who can assist with cultivation and stewardship, thanking the donors. And really, if you're going to be a successful organization, you've got to have the askers, successful in fundraising. So it's more important really to have those askers and ambassadors who are willing to do more for the organization. So when we talk about creating effective boards, a lot of times people will come to us and say, we've got our board, and right now our board's not willing to do anything. They talk about making calls. They tell us we need to raise money, but they're not doing it. And part of that is because we're starting the process really a little late. What we're doing is we're really trying to get people to understand their role of the board when they're already on the board. And we should be doing this much earlier in the process. It's sort of like hiring somebody. You don't decide, we're not really going to tell them what we expect of them, and maybe they're not capable, but we're going to hire them anyway, and then they're going to be able to do their job. So what we want you to do is start creating your effective board during the recruitment process. I had a major philanthropist tell me once that the most important committee that you have on a board is your board recruitment committee, your nominating committee, because they're the ones that will make sure all of your committees function. So we want people to have a year-round recruitment committee. We want people to make sure that they're explaining in developing a pool of prospects. We want people to make sure that when you're asking them to serve, that you go through their roles and responsibilities, and if giving and getting a gift is part of it, that you're telling them that up front, essentially making those expectations clear. You also then need to orient people. We had a client once that they weren't big enough to have their board meetings on site. And there were some board members who had been on the board for a year and had never actually toured that site and had not met the staff. So it's important that you're doing this formal orientation process and figure out maybe using board members who can help mentor your new recruits and talk to them every now and then and see if they have questions. And then as that person comes onto your board, making sure you educate them, train them, and don't do what the typical nonprofit does. The typical nonprofit agenda in this country hasn't changed in the last 50 years. And what happens is development is usually at the bottom, and you spend about 3 minutes on it. What we encourage people to do is really spend time during that board meeting, sharing successes, talking about calls, talking about challenges, getting people to tell their story. And then finally, what we want you to do is engage those board members. Include them in cultivating and stewarding people, getting them to talk about the names that they know, and meeting them once a year and letting them outline the 2 or 3 key things that they would like to focus on as an organization. So how do you really, once you've recruited these people properly and you've oriented them, how do you engage them in the fundraising piece? Part of what we've got to do is make sure that people are really talking to people that they know. They're much more comfortable with that. And sometimes we go in and we say, who are people you know that aren't connected to our organization? And we forget about those current donors. So what we want you to do is, let your new board members or your current board members look through your donor list and say, hey, I know these people. And, I could call them. I could thank them for their gift. I could say, hey, when's the last time you were out here? Come out, see what we're doing. And, I'd like to spend some time just letting you know what we were able to do with your last gift, how that had an impact for us. But remember that when we're talking about engaging your board in fundraising, it is not all about the ask. There are many ways that your board members can participate. They can invite somebody to your special event, your gala, your anniversary event. They can make personal visits, as I talked about, to go and talk to someone about how their gift has had an impact. You know, share stories of the kids you've helped with, the animals you've worked with, the art collection, the exhibit you were able to bring in. Bring them by for a tour, and again, make thank you calls. We have a number of our boards who just, you know, they pull out their mobile phones at the beginning of a board meeting, and they all make 4 or 5 calls to people, just thanking them for their gift, the gift they made last month or in the past quarter. And the thing is, it's a very easy thing for board members to do because most of the time what's happening is they're reaching somebody's voicemail, and they can leave that nice message there. Of course, one of the things that you really want your board to do is help you make the ask. The volunteers, where they meet with somebody in person, they have a plan, and what we want folks to do is keep in mind that when they're making this ask, they need to think about it as talking about why they're involved with the organization, why this organization is important to them, explain what their gift can accomplish, and really talk about it from a standpoint of opportunities that are there and how their gift can make those opportunities possible. You know, people want to hear. Studies tell us that people, what upsets them about an organization is the only time they hear from an organization is when that organization wants money. So it's good to let them know what their gift has accomplished. And whatever you do, be positive on the call. Don't make excuses for why people should or should not give. You know, it's not, you know, I know the economy's been tough the last 5 years. I know that, you know, you got 2 kids in private school. I know your business has gone through a difficult time. Oh, your daughter's getting married in a couple of months. Be positive and really don't make excuses for folks. Remember, there are 1 million+ nonprofits in this country, and people are going to be asking for money. And people need to hear from your volunteers to help validate why your organization should be one of their top priorities. So as we wrap up and I get ready to turn it over to Jay, this has been a quick 20 minutes going through some of the things you can do to engage your board, but remember that it all really starts with this board recruitment process and making sure that your board members and volunteers are clear with what you want them to do. And if they tell you they can't do it, it's okay to say, you know, this is what we need. Maybe there's another way that you could help us by serving on a committee. And make sure that there's a constant training and education of your board and that you involve them not just in the ask, but in that cultivation and stewardship. There's money out there. People are going to give. But people do not wake up in the morning. I doubt anybody on this call woke up this morning and said, I have got to give some money away. There's money out there. People have to be asked. And if nobody's asked, they're not going to give. So if the board can tell that positive story and invite somebody to participate, they typically will. Jay, I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Thank you. Thank you, Keith. And getting ready for this meeting, one of the tools that we work with within the Bloomerang database is connecting up with a prospect research database. And I looked myself up in there for a particular reason because one of the things we show there, Keith, is it shows all of the boards that people sit on and how many direct relationships they have with current and past former board members. And it shows how many board terms that each of those have had. So I looked there. I wasn't quite sure in my 30 years in the sector. I have now served on 29 different board terms spanning 14 different boards. So some of them, are 2 terms. Some of them are 3 terms. for that. But what I thought was fascinating, Keith, to bring this all to focus is I had a direct relationship with people that I've sat in board meetings with either currently or in previous years to over 1,830 people that I had a direct relationship that I've sat in boards with. And I thought that is so significant because I know I'm not uncommon. I mean, I'm still in my 50s. Can you imagine people that are in their 60s, 70s, and 80s? How many direct relationships they have, Keith? As you well know, it could exceed that very easily. So I want to talk a bit about the missing piece of the puzzle because the effective use of a donor database allows board fundraising to be a natural progression of the relationship. And what I'm talking about there is the fact that we want to be able to find and know about engagement. And Keith touched on this already. It's not so much trying to introduce people that don't already know the organization. How many of your current supporters do your board members have a relationship with in some way, shape, or form? And I like to use the comparison to a linchpin. The linchpin is literally the person that holds the various elements of a structure together. And that's what our board is all about. I mean, governance is one thing, but holding the structure together makes a big difference. And how we go about bringing in the best practices for this, I know Keith probably knows one or both of these individuals very well. We work very closely as we created the software and figuring out what was important for people to use with two very well-known national experts. On the right is Mr. Dr. Adrian Sargent, our chief scientist, who's sort of the father of donor engagement and donor retention. And on the left is Mr. Tom Ahern, who is our donor communications head coach. And so much of what we're referring to here revolves around communication. So I'm going to spend a little bit more talking a little bit about Tom's influence and how it ties into what Keith has been talking about here. Because this engagement, we measure by this engagement meter that you see right here. And people can move from cold to cool to warm to hot to on fire. And you'll see examples of those as I show a couple other screenshots. But the engagement meter is sort of neat in that it's the thermometer of your database. It's the thermometer for each of the individuals that you have in the database, and it's updated based upon all these different factors. And I'll show you some of those factors. And we use Adrian and Tom's formulas and algorithms on what is important. For instance, how many points or how much juice should you get for upgrading your gift from one year to the other? How much do you get for being a board member? How much do you get for being a volunteer or attending an event? So those are all items that work behind the scenes to update that every single day, and it doesn't require any setup by the users. I've worked with larger database systems where there was some sort of a point value system, and I've literally watched people spend 12 months, 18 months, 24 months trying to figure out this point system in order to move forward. And I thought, wow, how much time did they lose in that 18 months of when they could have been contacting and working with people? So we want it to be, as Keith talked about, the springboard for major giving and legacy giving from this. So here's an example of an individual that's in a warm category, and here's someone that's on fire. So you can see it literally moves up or down based upon the factors that you see listed here. And those factors are a combination of communication, transactions, and just relationship building that takes place in general. We take a look at whether they're a cash donor or a sustaining donor, where they're doing a recurring gift or a multi-year pledge, the number of years of consecutive giving, whether or not they're upgrading or downgrading, whether or not they lapse. We also take a look at these two items here, whether or not they volunteer or attend events, as I was referring to. And most of the time, that comes over from the linkages with the website. So if people can sign up for an event or sign up to volunteer via your website or some other device, that automatically comes into your database and updates it. And then we focus in on some communication areas. Since Bloomerang has a complete email engine, we can see whether or not someone opens your emails, whether or not they click on links, whether or not they forward it to people, whether or not they unsubscribe, whether or not we have their communication preferences on file. Those all come into play to know, are we making small little movements in that communication area? Are we connecting with them? Do we have inbound interactions? We all know how much different it is if someone calls us or emails us, or Keith was alluding to people stopping by for a tour. The nonprofits I've been on the board of, when people stop in on their own to go for a tour for that, I hope that the organization gets them directly to the executive director or to the development or VP of development, so we can see, because this is someone who's gone out of their way to show a genuine interest in it, much like somebody who contacts us and says, hey, my address has changed and I want to stay on your mailing list. Keep me informed of what's going on. Those are people that those inbound interactions, you'll love this, because Adrian tells us to count those double. Soft credits, any sort of stewardship. So if they're bringing in a matching gift company or a family foundation, or they're bringing people to sit at their table at a gala, any type of stewardship we give a lot of additional juice to. And then one of the things we're going to be doing in the near future is bringing the entire social media aspect in, whether or not they like you on Facebook, whether or not they follow you on Twitter or LinkedIn, or whether they're saying anything about you. Those all come together to move this meter up or down and to make a difference for that. So it really allows you to make that come to life. We also show this in a timeline. Yes, go ahead, Keith.
Can I just jump in real quick? You're talking about
certainly.
Piece, and you know what's interesting is when you talk about this engagement piece, and I'll just spend a second on this, is that oftentimes we also find these board members or boards are saying, where do we find these people? And where do we find board members? And they always want to go off looking somewhere else. And what you just ran through, the volunteer engagement, the people that are coming to your events, the people there's your pool right there. And it's important to really look at these engagement factors and how people are participating. So sorry about that. Just wanted to really jump in.
Oh, please do, Keith, because we want to tie it all together to your entire best practices for the board. One of the other areas that we do is we pull this together in a timeline similar to what a Facebook timeline is. So you can see over in the left-hand side there all of the touch points, and then on the right-hand side you can see the highlights of what moved the needle the most in any one particular year for that. So you can imagine, in addition to showing someone on your board a list of donors, if they know somebody, could you imagine popping this up on their phone, Keith, before they make phone calls, so you can see how many times that they've communicated with other people at the organization and what's been happening in a summary fashion? It would make that communications much, much easier, because we really pull all this together and once again use the formulas and algorithms to decide what weightings come into play, and makes it very easy to use for a smartphone or tablet in order to be able to take track of every single touch point that we've had with that donor. And in the case of board members, for the board members too, obviously they would be one of the ones there. Now, the next area I want to talk about is focusing a little bit on some of the communication best practices from our communications coach, Tom Ahern. I love one of his quotes here: successful direct mail appeals are quite simple. At heart, they are love letters to donors, prospects woven through with clear cries for help. And what I wanted to talk about just briefly is that first touch point with somebody, and what I'm referring to here is engagement in my book begins with the thank you. And I've told this story many times, Keith. You may have heard me speak at the Giving Institute when I was a speaker there a couple of times. But one of the experiments I ran for many years with one of my technology companies that was involved with the nonprofit marketplace is, for every new employee, I gave them a $100 bill. And I said, your job is to make 20 gifts to various nonprofits of $5 each, and watch how they begin to engage with you and decide who creates a relationship with you and who does not. And I gave them two rules, and this is a little exercise or experiment that every one of the listeners out there can do too. Those 20 gifts, I told them they had to divide them so that half of them went to local nonprofits and half of them went to national nonprofits. And the other rule that I instituted was half of them were online donations and half of them they had to send in via the mail. and watch what would happen. And what was interesting, Keith, over a 10-year period, at least 1/3 of those $5 gifts were never acknowledged. And some of the ones, when they were acknowledged, you could just tell it was a very straightforward form letter to do that. But what I thought was the most insightful is that people would report back to me at the end of 6 months and tell me who had built a relationship with them. And some of my employees and former employees are still supporting those organizations in a much bigger way today, based upon that.
That's, as you look at it from an anecdotal piece of doing that, but all the research, Jay, it just backs all of that up. That people want to be thanked, and if they're not, they remember it and they move on. And major donors do that same thing. It's not just a $5 donor.
Well, at the fact of being called an old fogey that just tells stories, let me tell you a story before I talk about this little grid here on the chart here. One of the things I've done over the years is help so many people put database software in, and there was a particular organization that I helped install their software that was in Chicago, and they will remain nameless for why. I had an opportunity to be back in Chicago for a nonprofit conference approximately 8 years later, and when I visited that nonprofit, Keith, one of the things I asked about was, could I take a look at your thank you letter? And lo and behold, 8 years later, they were still using the same single thank you letter to thank every type of gift, whether it was from a board member, an existing donor, a new donor, a high-level donor, a low-level donor, and they had not changed the words or the phrases in that thank you letter for 8 solid years.
Wow.
And so often is the case, the reason being that we often leave that acknowledgement process in the hands of an administrative person who really doesn't, in some cases, know a lot about fundraising and how to do segmentation and how to take care of this. So let me give you a little clue here and a little way of going about this. If you can just divide your thank you letters into 4 quadrants, the line going across the middle here, we're going to make that line. Anything above that is people that have made a gift above your average gift amount, and here are folks that are below your average gift amount. So if you can go in your database and you can say the average gift to my organization is $172.57, anything above $172.57 is in the top half, anything below that's below. And then this line here is whether or not they are a new donor or a repeat donor. So you have new people above, repeat above, new below, repeat below. And if you can set up so that there are 4 different letters, and more importantly, on these top 2, this should also include a telephone call here, maybe a handwritten note, anything that allows you to make that much more special. Keith, I loved your story about the board members at the beginning of the board meeting picking up the phone to do that. I'm on the board of a well-known nonprofit in Indianapolis. One of the things that's waiting for me at every board meeting are 5 little notes with the name of the organization and the name of 5 new donors. And as a board member, I write a handwritten note thanking them for making their very first gift to our organization and telling them what that money was going to be used for.
That's a great
and Oh, it's amazing the difference. So if you could come in and come about with these 4 different segments and map out a little bit of a communication strategy for each one, particularly for this left-hand side, for the new donors, for this one and this one here, map out a 90-day plan. So I'm going to try to with my free-form mouse here, but my hope would be, based upon the best practices, that you have some sort of a touch point with them at least 2 or 3 times in that first 90 days so that they know that they are welcome and they know that they have a chance to be part of your family to do that. Now, I want to take it one step further by showing you something that we also developed with Tom that will apply to these letters. We have a little something up here called the Ahern Audit. And Keith, you'll get a kick out of this. Any letter you're about to send out of the system, whether it was an appeal letter or a thank you letter, you can touch this button and it will come back and it will run 2 little tests for you in 5 seconds or less. I'm going to talk about the test at the bottom. The first thing it will do is scan the letter and tell you what grade level it is written for using the Fleisch-Kincaid reading test. It says here that this letter was written at a 6th grade reading level, which passes our test, because any appeal letter and thank you letter is best written if it's written between the 6th and the 8th grade level, because people scan these letters. They're not reading a book, they're scanning your letter. And then the top one, which is even more important, is the U test. And this is where it looks at all the pronouns in the letter, and it determines if you've used pronouns focused on the donor or the prospect more times than you have pronouns focused on yourself or your organization. So in other words, you've used you words, in this case 11 times, and we words 5 times. So you have a 2-to-1 ratio and you pass the test. If it did not pass the test, we mark it sort of a reddish pink here. And in this case, they flunked both the U test and the Fleisch-Kincaid reading level test. And Keith, can you imagine what the ripple went through our customer base the first time all of our users of our software checked their letters to see how they came out on this?
What were the results?
It was really sort of a mixed bag. There was a lot of celebration when their thank you letters and appeal letters passed the test, but there were a lot of people saying that they had to go back and make a little bit of adjustments, particularly those letters that had been approved by a committee. Very seldom do the committees ever allow them to pass the test, because they usually end up adding too much verbiage and taking things out, and they talk more about the organization, and it really causes that to not be the case to make that happen. So it allows you to bring that there. So one of the things that I would like to also talk about is just 5 little principles that can drastically improve first-year retention and help you with your acknowledgments. Number 1 is the 48-hour rule. If you can respond back within 48 hours of a gift coming in, that is the ideal time for that, because people are used in this world for instant gratification. Be different than the rest. That's where the handwritten note or the phone call or the slightly more personalized letter can make the difference. The handwritten rule of communications, anything that's handwritten, people will sometimes keep those for years, particularly if it's personal in nature. Another key factor there is state exactly what the monies will fund. And then if you can, as a secondary part of this, call or see the person in some way, shape, or form after the fact, particularly those that are brand new donors or people that are above the average gift amount. You will truly differentiate yourself from the rest of the pack there with that. So with that in mind, I'm going to leave you with those 5 thoughts. Stephen, are there some questions that we want to throw to Keith and I? I understand we've got about 15 minutes left here.
Yeah, we got some time for questions. There was a lot of good ones coming through, especially after Keith finished. So we're just going to jump right back into them, not waste any more time. So this first question comes from Catherine, and she was wondering what you should do if your board chairperson doesn't understand the need to recruit new members who are going to be involved in all the things that Keith mentioned, asking for donations and all these things. What can you do to sort of start at the top there with the chairperson of the board?
Well, and I think part of the reason, you need to make sure that you've got active committees. And I know that's easier said than done, but oftentimes what we find is usually when you have a chairperson like that, they're sort of running the organization on their own, and they're not really engaging these committees. And oftentimes what we find is other people don't necessarily feel that way. So I think, one, if you can make sure that you're getting a nominating committee together and really starting to look a little bit and discussing, what are the expectations that we should be having as a board, and really beginning to present those back. Now, a lot of times what we find is that, these board chairs are saying, oh, no, we can't ask people to do this, we can't ask them to do that. But when you end up doing it with a committee, you're starting to form some of those alliances with other board members who are really starting to back up the process and the importance of doing it. I think you also need to start to look at board members and showing them some of the statistics of giving. For instance, where money is coming from and why that it's so important for board members to help open doors. And I think, again, part of it is, maybe not think of it as that the board member has to do the ask, but what we're trying to do is get board members to open doors and tell their stories, essentially being an ambassador for the organization. Let's get them to ambassadors before we get them to be askers.
Great. Great. There's another question here from Kathy. She was wondering what's an optimum size for a board? Is there a size that's too large? Should you try to keep it under 20, try to keep it under 10? What's been your experience with the size of a board?
Do you want me to take that one, Stephen?
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead, Keith, and I'll have a comment on that too.
Okay. There was actually, personally, we've always advised clients that the number ought to be somewhere between like about 14 and 18. But there was actually a study done about a year or so ago that through Giving USA and a couple of other folks, AFP did, looking at some boards that were successful in fundraising. And the board is somewhere between, if you have less than 10, you're not going to be successful with fundraising because you don't have enough people. What was also interesting is those organizations that think, well, the more the merrier. And what they also found is if you had over 30, you weren't successful. So the big number in there where most organizations saw the most success with fundraising, the percentage that met their goal, they had somewhere between 11 and 20. Now, the next was groups that had between 21 and 30. I think if you're a national or statewide organization, maybe you look somewhere in that 21 to 30 range. But I think otherwise, if you're a local nonprofit, somewhere probably, again, within about that 14 to 20 range would work for you.
And I will certainly, go ahead, Keith. And I will certainly second that. The ones that I've found to be most successful and have met annual fund goals and capital campaign goals have been in that 15 to 20 range. And more importantly, take it another step, the committees that they have, the committee size that has worked the best regarding that were 3 people, because if you get more than 3 on a committee that's taken some sort of action, except the recruitment committee, I'll have to say that was caveat, people sometimes think they can share the responsibility with somebody else, but when it's just 3 people, that committee tends to get a lot done, and everybody takes an equal amount of the work to be accomplished for that. And so I've been involved where there were committee sizes of 5, 6, 7, and they didn't seem to get as much done as the committees that had just 3 people on them, except, like I said, the exception being the recruitment committee, that a lot of times we had 4 or 5 people involved with that group.
And Jay, just to add on to that, I think your point about committee size, if you end up having too many, and you have, let's say you have 15 board members, and you have 6 or 7 people in each committee, all of a sudden you have board members, they're just serving on, way too many committees. And as you said, oh, I can miss that one because somebody else will pick it up. And it's really not just even on the committee side, it's sort of on that board side. Part of the reason we feel like if you're up in that 20-plus range, then people start to say, oh, if I miss that meeting, it's really not a big deal because somebody else will pick it up. And you're not engaging and building emotional connections with people because if they miss one meeting and you meet every 2 months, you're not going to see them again for 4 months.
Yeah, and if your board chair is talking in terms, do we have a quorum today? You may have a quorum, but you've also got a problem.
Right.
Great. There was a question just popped in the chat from Elizabeth, and it was something that I was actually wondering since Keith finished up his presentation. And she loves all the strategies for recruiting new board members, but she's wondering what advice you might have for trying to implement these things for current board members who maybe aren't as engaged and maybe are resisting some of these things. How can you engage those folks? Is it appropriate to maybe relieve them of their board membership? What can you do for folks who are already part of a board that's not really working?
Keith, can I jump in with that one first?
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah. One of the things that I've always tried to bring with any board that I've had the privilege of serving on is insist that they have some sort of a board orientation process. And that orientation can be the hour before the board meeting. It can be a 3-day orientation. I've seen them be as long as a half a day. And one of the things, if they've not done a board orientation process before, I highly suggest that the first time they run it for new members, that all of the existing members who have never been through a board orientation get to go through it too. And if people are resistant to that, then you really got a clue that maybe as they finish up their current term, that should be their last term.
I think, Jay, that's a great point. We've actually done that with some groups where we were doing capacity building work for, it was funded by a local community foundation, and we found that a number of the current board members had never been through an orientation. It really at a level, that it needed to be. And when they went through that, it really opened up their eyes. So I think that's a great point. I think the other thing is we're very big advocates on having term limits, and term limits that are real, because people frankly get tired. And so what I mean by real is it doesn't mean that you serve a 2-year term and it can go on for 20 years. That you serve, is it 2-year terms, 3 2-year terms, whatever it is, but at some point you've got to go off that board. Doesn't mean you can't come back at some point, but that's a way to get people engaged and to move people off who aren't doing as well. And then I think the other is part of that orientation is really starting to use some of your board meetings where you can let people just talk, tell stories, do some education sessions. Let a board member who made a successful ask or got a big gift, let them talk about that and what happened. And, they're going to be charged up about it, and it's a way to help educate those board members. Having said that, it will not happen overnight. You're going to have to do a lot of small things to make that work and spend some time doing it.
Mm-hmm. One of the fun things that I did, Keith, and I don't know if it ties into the question there, but when you talk about having strategic discussions and stuff at the board meeting, this was a smaller nonprofit. I'm not sure you could pull this off on a bigger one, but we had a board with about 14, 15 people involved with it. And when I took over as chair of it, I said at the first meeting, I said, we're going to disband. We're not going to do the normal quarterly reports and et cetera for that. And I had one of the administrative people pass out everybody a sheet of paper, and I said, I want you to write down on that sheet of paper what you think the average gift from all of our donors is to us, to this organization. Make that your first number, and then I want you to write as the second number what you think the average amount of years that someone is a donor to our organization. And I collected all those, and out of 14 or 15 people, only 2 people were even close to the 2 actual numbers. It became the most strategic hour that we've ever had as a board as we talked about what those numbers really were and why.
Wow.
Yeah, and part of that, Jay, is because oftentimes boards don't talk about fundraising at their meeting, and once they do, it gets them moving. So that's a great idea.
Yeah, because most people just have no idea what that is, and of course Stephen knows where I'm getting at. Those 2 numbers, when you combine them, equal the lifetime value of a donor.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, here's a question from Ginny that's along those same lines. And Jay, you've served on a lot of boards and still do, and Keith, obviously you've worked with a lot of boards too. So what can you do about a board that maybe is a little too involved and is maybe micromanaging the actual programs and events and some of the activities that the nonprofit is doing? What can you do about that situation?
That is one of the most difficult challenges with a board. And board members need to realize that it's the staff who need to run the programs, and they oversee the organization. One of the things that we find a lot of times is that board members who are micromanaging, it oftentimes means that the board is meeting too often. So we find that a board that meets once a month I mean, for instance, unless you've got some emergency or crisis that's been going on, or you've got some major building project, most boards don't need to meet every month because
amen, brother.
Yeah, I mean,
I cannot say that hardly enough. That is far too often for any board.
And so that, and I'm not saying in this case it would be interesting, the person that asked that question, how often the board meets, but what happens is by the time you're done with one meeting, gosh, you're getting ready for the next one, and you don't even have time for committees in between. And so I think the way you've got to take micromanaging away is starting to look at your organization more strategically. How often do we meet? You've got to have active committees. Don't let your board be a committee of the whole. And frankly, you've got to have a board chair that's willing to look at people and just say, that's not our role. And that's the tough part. So I wish there was a real easy answer for that, but I'm not sure there is.
Well, one of the things I think too, Keith, that can keep that from being the case, if your typical board meeting is 90% comprised of giving reports from those types of areas that are more about the day-to-day running of the nonprofit instead of more on a strategic level. I've been at board meetings where they're giving operational reports, and that's just begging the board to get involved, ask questions, offering to do this, do that. You're waving the the bait right in front of the folks there, as the old saying goes, and you're just asking for that to be the case. So one of the things that I always try to do is to make sure that the operational reports, we summarize them and maybe show something at a very high strategic level once a quarter, but don't get into any of the weeds anymore about those.
Great advice. Well, we are approaching the 2 o'clock hour, and we're just about out of time for questions. I know we didn't get to all of them, but I do want to be respectful of everyone's time, especially as we approach the 2 o'clock hour here. So just in the final minute or two we have left, Keith, why don't you tell folks how people can learn more about you? Hopefully folks can ask you some questions that we didn't get time to answer.
Yes, thanks, Stephen. I mean, one of the key things, you see a slide up now that just lists everything from our website to our Facebook to our Twitter, and we do a lot where whether it's information that we're doing, I mean, based on a webinar like this, we'll probably do a posting on it. We do a lot with Giving USA. We do a lot, we do a blog, a few times a month. So you can go to our site and get a lot of good information either through our Facebook, Twitter, or just going to our blog. And if you do have other questions, because we didn't get to everything today, we'd be happy to answer those. And as we wrap up and I turn it back over to James, Stephen, just really want to thank you guys for the opportunity to do this today. It was a lot of fun. Thanks.
Yeah, it was really a great presentation. And Jay, you're also active on social media. I'm sure people can get a hold of you if they have any additional questions about us or Bloomerang.
Oh, very much so. Yeah, just check our website. It's bloomerang.co, and as the slide's up there right now talking about, you'll find out a little bit more about the database and the CRM. But more importantly, as you look at our blog there, you'll find we have guest blog posters, much like Keith, with 30 and 40 years of experience in the sector that really have some excellent advice. So it's well worth coming back to almost on a daily basis.
Absolutely. And if you enjoyed this webinar, we do these webinars weekly. And next week we've got a really fun presentation planned. We've got Nathan Hand, who's just a dynamite fundraising consultant, and he and I are going to be talking about social media and some ways that you can employ some good social media strategies to help your fundraising. So be sure to visit our webinar page.
Are you both going to have your Halloween costumes on?
Yeah, we might have to turn on the video sharing here so folks can see that.
Great.
Yeah, check that out. Definitely register for that if social media is something that interests you as it relates to fundraising. So we're just about out of time. I want to say a final thanks to Keith for joining us and to Aaron for helping pull all this together. It was really a joy to have you guys speak about boards and share all your knowledge. So thanks again.
Thank you.
And thanks to everyone. Yeah, and thanks to everyone who took an hour out of their day to listen to us. And For those of you who maybe had to cut out early or missed the beginning, we will be sending out the slides and a recording later this afternoon. So look for an email from me in just a few hours. So with that, I'll say have a great rest of your afternoon and a great rest of your week. Bye now.